Hey guys, Rich from Richmond Gaming. Hope everyone is doing fantastically well. Welcome to this episode 5 of our beginner's guide for Star Wars Shatterpoint, where we're taking the entire rulebook, putting it into a video format, and hopefully making it that little bit easier for you guys to get ready when the game is released at the beginning of June, which is less than 2 months away now. Really looking forward to getting my hands on this game. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on in the video how we may even be getting our hands on the game that little bit earlier, and even running some demo games at one of our local gaming stores as well. Also, a quick reminder that we are giving away a Star Wars Shatterpoint core box. We're going to be doing the draw for that in less than a week, I think it is, May the 4th, maybe just over a week. So make sure you hang around to the end of the video to see what this week's question is going to be. And with all of that, let's jump in and talk about movement, which is going to be the topic of today's video. Movement obviously plays a really big part in Star Wars Shatterpoint, and at first glance when you look at the rules as we've gone through and you see that you can only make one move action per turn, it may feel like movement is quite limited, but as you'll see, there's lots of other ways to be able to move your characters around. So let's jump straight into it. Okay then guys, so movement in Star Wars Shatterpoint. We're going to go through a couple of different types of movement. We'll look at the tools, we'll look at the different move actions that every single character can make. Then there's some unique abilities that only certain characters will have access to. And we'll also take a look at character displacement as well, whether that's your own characters or whether that is an enemy character. So let's start then with the movement and range tools. So every single character, when they are making an advance in Star Wars Shatterpoint, uses the same tool. So whereas in other games you have different speeds of characters, so in Marvel Crisis Protocol, for example, you've got short, medium and long. In Star Wars Legion you've got range 1, 2 and 3. In other games, you know, you can move them different numbers of inches and everything and like that. Every single character, when they're making a standard advance, is going to use this standard advance tool. And if you look really closely, the symbol there, and I'll show you the symbol in a second, is going to match up. We've then got a shorter tool, which is known as the dash tool. And then the only two movement tools that we get in this game. And you'll notice there's a little notch on there. We'll go into why that's there when we show you how to use these tools. We've then got a set of 5 range tools. So we've got a range 2, a range 3, a range 4, a range 5. Now we also have a shove tool. Now this shove tool we talked about for a long time. I thought, oh, it's got some notches on there, maybe it's going to do certain things. No, it's just been designed in such a way that you can get it underneath terrain, so underneath the gantries, and making it much easier. And the edge of it there is actually the exact same size as all of the other range tools, which is going to be a range 1. So just like we do in Marvel Crisis Protocol, if you want to use a range 1 for anything, that's the edge that you're going to be using. You can use the shove tool, or indeed you can use any of the other tools as well, or any of the other range tools as well. It is a range 1, which is going to be I think 1 inch, but you don't necessarily have to use the shove tool for certain things. It's also worth pointing out that whilst the 2, 3, 4 and 5 range tools are identical in size to Marvel Crisis Protocol, there is a slight difference in the 2 movement tools, so they're not going to be transferable from one game to the other, but if you do have range tools from Marvel Crisis Protocol, you will be able to use those. So let's take a look at how we actually use the movement tools in Star Wars Shatterpoint, because if you've come from Star Wars Legion or maybe Marvel Crisis Protocol, they're going to be very familiar. If you've come from some other game formats, MESBG or 40k or some of the many other games out there, especially when you're usually using not designated measuring tools, but you're actually using range rulers or what are they called? Tape measures, that's the word I was looking for, because you're measuring out in inches. This may be slightly different. So just run through how they work. So you've got your character's base there, and you can see here, this is where that little notch comes in. So there's two ends to the movement tool. There's the end that you put against the character, and then there's the other end, which is where you can end up. You'll notice a little pivot in the middle there, or the little, I don't know what you call it, but yeah, extra little pivot thing in the middle. That allows us to bend the range tool. So as you can see there, it bends in multiple directions, all the way up to, I think, 90-degree angle is sort of the maximum that you can get there. But where this differs ever so slightly and what used to catch people out a lot in Marvel Crisis Protocol is that it's what we refer to as front to end. So we start off with the movement tool at the very front of the model, and then we can move it all the way along to the very end of the model. So we actually need to take into account the unit's base size when we talk about movement in this game. It comes up a lot in Marvel Crisis Protocol because even a character with a medium base, if they move short, they actually have a half decent movement range. With a large base and short, it's really, really good. So that will also come into play in Star Wars Shatterpoint as well. It's also worth noting that you can actually move your character along any part of the movement tool, as long as the where you finish off with a character, they end up touching that movement tool. That is considered a legal move. So let's have a look then at the different types of movement actions or move actions that we've got in the game. So first of all, and the most common one, is going to be an advance. And as we mentioned already, that is going to use that longer movement tool or that advance tool that we've got. And you can see there that the symbols line up on that one. Next one is going to be a dash, and that is unsurprisingly going to use the shorter dash tool. And once again, you can see the symbols line up on there. And lastly is going to be a climb. And a climb is also going to use that shorter movement tool as well. And that's it. They are the only three different types of movement actions that you can make in this game that every single character has access to. So let's take a look at each of those in turn, see when you use them, and see when you have to revert to one of the other ones. So starting off with an advance, this one's going to be pretty straightforward. It's kind of what we've just shown in the previous demonstration of how we use the movement tool. So we put the little curved edge up against the model itself. You can then bend it into whatever position you want. And then as long as your character ends that movement whilst they're still touching the base itself. So remember that the base and the tool do not need to overlap. They just need to be touching, and that is absolutely fine. However, there are some stipulations as to when an advance can be used. First of all is that you cannot use an advance if you are engaged with a non-wounded character. Now, what does being engaged mean? Well, again, we're not going to go into too much detail because we're going to leave that for when we talk about attacks, and in particular melee attacks. But basically, if you are within range 3 of any other non-allied character, that is a character, not a unit, then you are considered to be engaged. And if you are engaged, you're not going to be able to use the advance action. Secondly is that the tool cannot overlap impassable terrain at a higher elevation than the advancing character. This one, whilst it's in the rulebook, when it says it can't overlap, realistically, you may be finding yourselves in some positions where it does overlap, but what it actually means is that you can't end a character's movement at a higher elevation, but it can end at a lower elevation. So that overlap one is a little bit misleading. It may be that just sometimes because you want to be able to move along and that you can't end at a higher elevation, but for whatever reason, just because of the length of this thing, it might be touching terrain or anything like that. That's not really what it's getting at here. What it's getting at is you cannot end your movement at a higher elevation than what you started off. And if you remember from one of the other videos, elevation is within range 2 from the bottom of your base upwards. So if a piece of terrain is below that, you can end your movement on there, but if it's above there, you're not going to be able to end your movement above that range 2 place. Okay then, so what if we want to make a movement, but we are engaged with another character, with an enemy character? Well, this is where dash comes in. So we've got our same character here, but they are within range 2 of an enemy character. This basically limits them, and they're not going to be able to take that advance action. So they need to, almost, if you imagine, it's like disengaging from combat. So to do that, we use the dash tool, which is going to be the shorter tool, and the rules are exactly the same. We place a little curved edge up against the side of the unit, and then we can move anywhere along that movement tool, and if we want, all the way to the very, very end. There are, however, again, some things that we can't do. And once again, it's that overlap impassable terrain at a higher elevation than the advancing character. But what it's actually meaning is the character cannot end its movement at a higher elevation, but it can end at a lower elevation. It's also worth noting here as well, and again we'll go into it in more detail, that you are only considered engaged with an enemy character if they are at the same elevation level as you. So if you're not at the same elevation level, then you're not considered engaged. And talking of elevation levels, we've seen there 2 examples of movement that can't allow us to traverse terrain. So that brings us to climb. So we've got our character in the bottom left-hand side there, and then we've got a piece of terrain, can be absolutely anything, but it's going to be higher than range 2, so above our elevation zone. So once again, we're going to use that same smaller or shorter even movement tool. We're going to place the curved edge up against the actual base of the unit, but the big difference here is that it can overlap terrain, and it does mean that we can end at any elevation. Now that any elevation is really important because you don't have to just climb up one sort of set of elevation at a time. So there could be 2, 3, maybe even 4 if you're going to do a really tall buildings, but it can end at any of those elevations. So verticality in terms of a climb doesn't matter. It's just the distance that you're moving along the board. A character, however, cannot end its movement overhanging terrain. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, take a quick look at this picture of Count Dooku here. You'll see that his base, the base of his unit, is overhanging the edge of the terrain. Overlapping is fine. That's what we refer to it as when something is on top of the other, whether it's another piece of terrain or indeed a character, but it cannot overhang. So you have to be fully over the edge. That also goes for terrain that is too small. There may be some terrain on the board that the characters with the smaller bases can actually climb up and sit on, but maybe something like the B1 battle droid, because their base is slightly bigger, they've got 3 units in there, they're not going to be able to actually get up there. And lastly is you cannot use the climb tool if you are engaged with a non-wounded character. Exact same rules that we talked about during the advanced example. Now, as I mentioned, there are lots of other movement types in the game. Some may take action, some may not take action, some will cost force power. So if we take a look here at a Sarge Ventress's card, for example, see, she's actually got a couple of different ways of being able to move. She's got her force push, which is going to allow her to move other characters. She's got Dathomarian dexterity, which is going to allow her to make jumps herself. She's got slip away, which is going to allow them to make a different type of move called a reposition. And then actually on her identity, she's got advances in there as well. So these can be triggered through varying different parts. We've also then got stance cards. So once again, if we take a look at Form 2 Makashi, if we go along the top there, we've got jumps. If we go down the bottom, we've got something called a shove, which we'll talk about in a little moment. But we've even got reactive jumps on her duelist training as part of her defensive role. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can obtain different types of movement, both in and out of turn. You just need to remember that rules apply. So even if we look at the Sith Assassin, Paul will skip round right down to the bottom bit there where it says it may also advance. Now, yes, there's an or something else in there, and we'll get onto that in a moment, but Asajj, if there was another character that she was engaged with, even if she'd met all the other requirements, because she's engaged with another character, she isn't going to be able to use that advance. So let's take a look then at the other different movement types. First of all, we have jump. It is going to work identical to the climb. It's absolutely identical to the climb, with the exception of one thing, is that you can use it if you are engaged with an enemy. So you'll notice on Asajj's card back there, whilst we couldn't use the advance, she would be able to use that jump, and it of course uses the shorter movement tool there as well. Next up, we have reposition. Typically, you're going to find this on stance cards, but I've seen it dotted around other character cards as well. And this is exactly the same as an advance. So it's going to use that full length movement tool, but once again, with the exception that you're not bound by the engaged rules. So you can use this whilst you're engaged to get yourself out of being engaged with another character. We then have shove. Now this, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. This is appearing quite a lot on a lot of characters' stance cards. It's a very, very effective way of being able to move your opponent off a point, but also move yourself onto the point as well. So we'll talk about how that works. And remember, whilst we've put the shove tool up there, any of the range tools are going to be able to be used for this, because they're all just a range 1 when you flip them around the other side. And lastly is kind of a few different things combined is going to be a push, pull, place. The reason that I mention these is they're actually going to use the range tools and not the movement tools in this game. Something that if you're coming from Marvel Crisis Protocol is a little bit different, because we've always used movement tools for pushes. I do like the inclusion of pull here as well, because it does make things... It was always really weird that you could push somebody towards you when we all know that the real word is pull. But it's in there, so yeah, we'll take a look at each of these in turn. Starting with push. And we're going to be seeing this is a push away. We'll show you another example, and we'll talk about another example in a little bit. But a push away, how does it work? Well, we've got our character, and let's say that our character is Asajj Ventress, and she has the ability Force Push, which is choose a character in this unit and an enemy character within range 3 of that character. Push the chosen character away from the enemy allied character, and you get to do that for range 3. So we've got our enemy character here, could be anyone that you want. And the first thing we need to do is draw an imaginary line from the center of Asajj's base through to the enemy target character. And then from there, place the long movement tool at a 90-degree angle as shown. And this is basically going to give us our arc. So what this means is that the enemy character that we're pushing, whilst it is away, it doesn't have to be directly away. We've got a 90-degree arc there that we can push the character in. And these lines sort of represent where the target couldn't go over. So that's the sort of furthest that they could move over. So what does that look like? Well, if we were to take the range 3 tool, you can see we can put it directly up there. We can put it going the right-hand way as well. And this would be the extremes that we could push the character. Or we could just push them as far back as we wanted. And let's just do that. Let's push that character as far back. Now, the things with a push are that it needs to travel through the center. So it's through the center of the range tool and must go the full distance. However, there is an exception to that rule, and that exception is when we put in a piece of terrain. So let's reset that. We're going to push them again, and as you can see, the terrain that is there is now stopping that character from being moved. So A character being pushed must travel the full distance down the centre of the range tool unless it collides with terrain of the same elevation or higher. Now what this means is that you can actually push somebody off the edge of the building, but their entire base needs to fall off the edge of the building. Now there is no fall damage in this game. It was something that people were asking for, but it would have been very, very complicated. But if you remember that picture of Dooku that we brought up, then in that instance, Dooku would not be able to be pushed all the way to the very end. He would actually stop at the last legal position, which would be with his base right flush up against the edge of the terrain. However, if your range tool could overlap or overhang even, then you could happily push somebody off the side of a building. I'd like to take a minute to thank the brand new sponsor of the channel, Loyalist Games. Loyalist are a great local gaming store in West Yorkshire. They stock all of your favourite MCP and Shatterpoint products, plus a huge range of other gaming systems. They also have an awesome gaming space where weekly events are held. We've already been running our MCP League that's coming into its 4th season. We've hosted a number of MCP events and we'll be doing so for Shatterpoint as well. So hopefully we can see you guys there at some of the events in the future. There'll be a link down in the description below, and if you're looking for a place to get all of your hobbying purchases at a great price, then look no further than Loyalist Games. Let's take a look at pull towards. So once again, we've got our character. This time it's going to be Lord Maul using There Is No Place to Run. Cost 2 force power, but I think this one is going to be very, very good. It says choose a character in this unit and an enemy character within range 3 of that character. Pull the chosen enemy character range 2 towards the chosen allied character. And then it gains something else that we won't talk about now. So let's look at the setup here then. So we've got Lord Maul in the corner, and we've got our unnamed clone, let's say it is for this one. And once again, we need to draw ourselves an imaginary line from running through the 2 centre of the bases. And then the difference here is that we still place that range tool or that movement tool, but we're placing it at the back end of the enemy that we are pushing. And you can see there we've got that 90-degree angle. And once again, that is creating the arc for us that we can actually push somebody in. Or pull in, sorry, pull towards. That's the old MCP verbiage coming out there. So we put down our range 2 marker, and once again, they travel along the centre of that range tool all the way to the very, very end, but with the same rules applying. If there was some terrain in the way there, then that they would collide with, then they are actually going to stop, and they'll stop their movement as they hit that terrain. So we mentioned shove very, very briefly when we took a look at a Sarge's card, but let's take a closer look at this now. We've got Ahsoka Tano. We can see there that the first set of abilities on her combat tree is actually a shove. So Ahsoka Tano in her Form 5 Shien is going to get good access to this, only needing 1 success to go through to gain access to it. And you can see the sort of bigger symbol there, and it is the symbol that's shown on the card as well. Now, let's take a quick look through here. Then there's no range requirements for shove because you can do this at, well, in this instant is going to be range 2 because you need to be within range 2 to be engaged, and Ahsoka doesn't have a ranged attack or anything outside of range 2. I'm not sure if we're going to see you being able to shove characters from ranged attacks, only melee, but I think maybe Darth Maul can do it. I'd have to take a look and remind myself, but there's no specified range requirements of shove. So even if it's a ranged attack, you're going to be able to do it if your card allows you. But what is a shove? Well, we've got our enemy character here. And once again, we need to draw that imaginary line between the 2 characters. And once again, that is going to form our arc where we can shove the character. Now, what is a shove? It is essentially a push. It is a range 1 push away. Now it's the away part that's very, very important. So we put our range 1 tool down, and again we can do it in any direction, making sure that the character's base doesn't pass over those 2 arcs, and we can then push that character away. Now There is a follow-up part to shove, which is then something I mentioned earlier that it's really good for pushing your opponent off a point and moving yourself onto it. Now, let's take a look at the second part. Now, the second part is optional as well, so you don't have to do the second part follow-up should you not want to. But we've got our two characters. They're in their positions where we last left them, and we're once again going to draw that imaginary line. But this time, we are going to put down the tool behind the character that made the attack or made the shove. We've got our arcs, which are the arcs that we can move into. So again, another 90-degree arc. And essentially, we're going to push towards, pull towards, however the verbiage is, but we're going to have to go towards the character that we have just shoved. Now, it does mean that depending on the direction you push the character in, your follow-up move or your follow-up push of yourself doesn't necessarily need to be in the identical same direction. So if we look at this example here, we can actually make a movement that's going from where we are now to the right-hand side of the board. So placement's going to be very, very important in this game when it comes to combat and when it comes to scoring. And shove, I think, is a really, really good tool that's going to make sure those VPs are going back and forth very, very quickly, and it's not going to be one character or one player being able to just dump people on a point. I think characters are going to have lots of ways of being able to not only wound characters so that they can't contest, but actually move certain characters around as well. Let's then take a look at place. Now, place at the moment, there's not a lot that we do with place, but I just want to run through how it will work because it is slightly different to a push or a pull. Basically, we've got our character here. We put our, in this case, range 1 tool down. Okay, we're not going to use the shove tool. We're just going to use the edge of a range 2. And then basically we can place them anywhere within that range. Now, unless otherwise stated, we always measure from the object being placed. I imagine that's going to be a placeholder potentially for future abilities or future rules that come into the game. It can be placed anywhere, once again, as long as it fits, remembering that you cannot overhang terrain within the indicated range. And unless elevation is mentioned, the object can change elevation either higher or lower. Now, it's interesting that they refer to it as an object and not a character. Seems to me like there may be some abilities or even some particular maybe crisis missions. I call them crisis missions, phases, Shatterpoint, struggles. That's the word I was looking for. There may be certain struggles that allow you to move the actual tokens around. That's something that we do have in Marvel Crisis Protocol as well. It's just interesting that in the rulebook they use the word object. But let's have a look at one example that we've got of a character being placed at the moment, and that is going to be ingress points. We've already talked about climbing, we've talked about jumping, talked about being able to place. Ingress points are something that are slightly different. These are predefined points of a terrain that have 2 points, a top and a bottom, and players agree become an ingress point in the game, allowing a character to move freely up and down that point as they wish. Up is the most important one because anyone can move down terrain with no penalties there. So how is it going to work? Well, if a character finishes their movement by either using an advance, a dash, a climb, or indeed a jump, they're going to be able to use an ingress point. Now, they have to end their movement within range 1, and if they do, they can travel to the top of that ingress point and place themselves within range 1 of the top. So we can see here that one of the Mandalorians, they ended within range 1 and they moved to the top. Now you may be thinking, well, Rich, that's really interesting, but you've already told us that a jump and a climb can cover any elevation levels, because remember, a jump and a climb are identical, with the exception that a jump can be used whilst engaged. But if you imagine you've got a piece of terrain and actually you can't get all the way to the other end of it, and it's multi-tiered, you may not have enough movement to be able to actually get yourself up there, but there may be a ladder on the second level or something. You could do a climb up, end your turn or end your movement within range 1 of a second ladder, move up that ladder, and then place yourself within range 1 at that other point. And it could be, because if you remember, the rules of deployment are that objective markers go at the highest possible elevation level. It could be that that's what you need to get yourself up to an objective marker. But there we go, guys. That is everything, at least everything I think you need to know about movement in Star Wars Shatterpoint. Movement's very, very interesting in this game. It's going to be very, very fluid. When we start breaking down attacks, which is going to be the next video that we do, you'll really start to see how movement becomes very, very important in the game, how you resolve those in particular ways, and how you can get extra movement from your characters mid-activation, being able to move you from objective marker to objective marker. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. I think speed's going to play a big part in this game. We've got some characters, you know, Ahsoka gets around quite a lot. I imagine other characters like Count Dooku, for example, could find themselves being a little bit more static. But there we go, guys. Hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you could, please leave a like. And actually, as I mentioned, we are giving away a Star Wars Shatterpoint core box. So if you want to be in with a chance to win that core box, you need to do 3 things. First of all, you need to make sure that you've subscribed to the channel. That's a pretty standard one. You need to make sure that you've left a like on this video, and you need to answer a question. Now, the question that I've got for this week, and it's hopefully going to be able to help me out because I'm still in 2 minds. Where is your first setting, if you're building one, for your Star Wars Shatterpoint terrain board? Or even if you're not building one, where would you like to see a terrain board built being set around? Don't make it Tatooine. Tatooine is boring, it's been done to death. But where are some really cool locations that you can think of? And who knows, maybe you're not only in with a chance to win a Shatterpoint core box, it may end up being the terrain board that I make, because I'm still procrastinating over which one to go. As you saw back earlier in the video, if you want to go and actually pre-order the Star Wars Shatterpoint core box, go check out our channel sponsor, loyalist Games. They've got a great bundle available at the moment. And as I mentioned, once that demo box is coming, actually I didn't mention it, but I mentioned that we may be getting our hands on the box a little bit earlier. But once those demo boxes come into the local gaming stores, we're actually going to be running some weekly demo games for people who want to try it out. We'll also record a couple of them as well, so you can watch them online, but we will be doing a box opening and all that thing as well. So a big shout out to Leodis, the new sponsor of Richmond Gaming, and a big thanks to Neil there for helping us out with everything to do with Shatterpoint, and of course Marvel Crisis Protocol as well. We do also have our Discord up and running as well. It's completely free to join. There's a dedicated MCP page on there. There's a dedicated Shatterpoint page on there, plus a whole bunch of other things as well. And lastly, we do have our Patreon, where you, from as little as £1 a month, you can help support the channel and help me continue to make these videos. And as always, guys, it leaves me with just enough time to say stay well, keep safe, and until next time, may the Force be with you.